And welcome to Celebration of Consciousness. I am your host, Lorelei Drock. Today we have three speakers. We have Jonathan Van Valin, Ned Matinia, and Rev Ned Sheldon. I am so thankful that you're holding space with us today. Uh, we will start this space by doing an opening blessing and prayer over the. I ask that you can speak to whoever your team is that you would like to send your blessings and your energies with. I always respect everyone's space. So for just a moment here, if you just want to take a deep breath and sit here, um, I've already set the circle, so we are good to go. I ask that my guides, my angels, Yeshua, Mary Magdalene, and all my interdimensional brethren who want to hold space here with us today and add their energies for love, healing, connection, and grounding, be with us. And know that you are loved and supported in this space. I ask that each who are here or watching this in the future feel that divine love flow through them, knowing that they are a divine being made of pure light and love. And I invite all of you to feel that energy as we open this space. Thank you for adding your energies and your time in this space today. Thank you so much. Blessings and love. Now I'm going to introduce Jonathan. Jonathan, thank you for being with us today. Jonathan grew up in the suburbs of Seattle and led an outwardly ordinary adulthood, despite a quiet, ferocious inner search. After many unexpected spiritual experiences, including a near-death experience in 2011, he left his regular life entirely and went through a sort of final doorway in which a radical falling away of egoic self became the abiding ground of his being. After a few years spent nearly in silence, an inner prompt revealed a subtle healing ability, and a subsequent prompt to share what's been received has become the prime mover of Jonathan's life. His essential function, as he sees it, is to help people remove blocks to their awareness of their deepest being and to live from the peace that pours forth. Welcome, Jonathan, and thank you for holding space with us today.
Thank you so much, Lorelai. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see you all there. I'm tickled to discover that there's actually just a handful of familiar faces here today, in fact. And it's also really genuinely a joy to see a bunch of new faces as well. And so a personal uh, welcome to everyone here today. It's good to be here. It's nice to see you. So I believe I'm given to tell some stories first. I appreciate the introduction, Lorelai. And I must go back just a teensy bit earlier. That date that you mentioned, 2011, was a very pivotal time for me. It was not actually uh, the the date in which the NDE that I went through took place. That was actually 10 years before that, and it seems imperative to start there, I suppose. Even though I would say to anyone that this NDE story, as meaningful as it has been to me, was not the beginning of the story, really. Uh, and it, well, we'll get to it, but I guess we'll just jump into that. So, uh, at 29 years old, I was about to undergo a surgery. This is not an operating table thing. It lasted much, much longer than that. And the surgery was to remove a great deal of tissue in the back of my throat and actually a couple of chips of bone in the skull behind my nose. It's good to solve a sleep apnea issue that was relatively severe. And one of the things that's true about this particular surgery is that it has an exceptionally painful recovery. And that's going to become meaningful. It's a little bit of, I mentioned it because it's a detail that'll come up later. And at the time, the analogy I was given two. One of them was absurd. One of them was a male doctor who said, Jonathan, you're going to be one of the few men that know the pain of birth. And I looked at this man's eyes and I thought, you've got to be joking. How could you possibly say that to me with a straight face? And sometime later, a much more appropriate analogy was given me when someone said, you're going to know what it's like to break your femur and then have to walk on it for a week or more. Something like that. And it was true. Their analogies or not, they were pointing to something very accurately. Um, I went through the surgery. I was in the hospital for 4 days. I was somewhat booted out of the hospital and into the care of my father, who simply wanted to watch over me. Again, I wasn't a kid. I'm a 29-year-old adult at this point, and but as a single guy and at the time, and he um, very lovingly opted to want to watch over me. So I went out to the family house, which was 2 hours away from the city in the countryside, and he didn't really have much to do at all. I sort of sat and stared in corners and out windows and tried not to drool, and mostly failed in that part. And he kind of came in and out of the house all day long doing house chores and farm chores, and would look at me and go, well, I guess he's all right. And he was right about that. But there really wasn't much for him to do. And about 4 days into his care, I experienced inwardly in the middle of the day, I experienced what I can only best describe as a simple inner click. And in that, the moment of that click, it was instantaneously clear that my body was beginning to die. The way that presented itself was simply a extraordinarily clear awareness that the animating life force within was in fact draining away. It was just leaving, and it was going at a relatively slow pace. But the what took place in the moment of that click, and these things happened essentially simultaneously, even though I can only describe them in a linear way. But the very first thing that flooded in the recognition and awareness of that click and the recognition of that life force draining away was that there was a recognition immediately that I was not the body. And the reason that that was extraordinary in that particular moment was that what it meant was that the pain in that body was no longer mine either. It need not be identified with. So in the moment of recognizing that I wasn't the body, there was a complete and total freedom from the suffering. It's the very first time, it turned out not to be the last, but it was the very first time that I was shown the difference between pain and suffering, that those could be two different things. Not remotely the last time, but a powerful moment. Up to this point, it had been essentially between the hospital and my father's care. This had in fact been a week of as literal a hell as I could possibly have conceived. uh, and I think the reason I could understand it and experience it in those terms was that in the moment of that click, what was immediately clear was that there was this observing awareness, there was this observing consciousness, sort of being able to observe the body, recognize that the body, the life force in that body was beginning to drain away. But what was startling about it was that that awareness, that observer consciousness, as it's sometimes called, could also, with crystal clarity, be recognized that it's the sense of being in it was not only aware, but was not dying. It was very clear that that aware presence was perfectly fine, that the body might be dying, but that aware presence was actually unimpugned, unimpacted, unaffected, essentially, in any way by the fact that the body was beginning to uh, to lose its life force. And thus again the extraordinary experience of freedom that would flood in as a result. Not only was it seen that the fact that the body was dying was completely unimpacting to that aware presence, but if the body itself was completely unimpacting to it, there was actually nothing in the temporal realm at all, anything that could happen to that body, any of the sort of any of the general goings on of the four-dimensional time space that this body seemed to be in was really completely unaffecting to that aware consciousness, that aware uh, observing uh, consciousness. So that was the very first thing. Again, these things sort of bled in simultaneously, but um, in addition to that freedom and that complete release from the suffering in that moment, it was again also true that there's this awareness that that life force was draining away, but it was draining away rather slowly, and so it was very clear also that there was time. There was going to be at least a few days, and that in that moment seemed lovely. It seemed like an opportunity that I was going to have. And there was going to be a number of days in which I could just revel in that freedom that I tried to describe. And that sounded like a joy. And so rather than um, the idea that the life force draining away from this body as a problem or a tragedy or an issue, it did not present that way in the slightest. It presented itself as, oh my gosh, how extraordinary. What a remarkable freedom. How, what a gift to be able to know that this is an experience I will revel in for a little while. Um, and and on the heels of that, again, really all sort of simultaneously, arises a third recognition. And it's a third recognition that it really absolutely blows away the impact of these first two. If that may sound outrageous, but um, that third recognition flooded in, recognized that in that wit's consciousness, there was still a sense of being an individuated sense of self. That while that aware consciousness may not be seen or feel or experience as being limited by that body any longer, and clearly apart from it, and clearly unimpacted by it, free of it, if you will, that non bodily witness consciousness was still experiencing itself as an individuated but non corporeal sense of consciousness. And as the third recognition arises, it's seen that that too, that individuated but non corporeal awareness is dissolving. It is beginning to dissolve out of that individuation into what I can really only try to describe as losing its individuatedness and melting or merging into this overwhelming, all encompassing allness. It is losing its individuatedness. And that confers an experience, on that awareness of a greater level of freedom that becomes very, very difficult to put into words. But the because it begins to be freed even from that non-corporeal individuation. And if it's merging into what seems absolutely all and absolutely vast, then the sense of being a separated self, even a non-corporeal one, simply begins to dissolve. And it's dissolving into what seems like absolutely all. And the beauty of that I would stress, and I think it's something that I think we'll probably revel in and come back to often in the next over the course of the next hour or two, is that if something is all encompassing, then it cannot be missing anything. There can be in this, then, there can be no sense of loss of any kind. And so, if there's no sense of loss, there cannot be any sense of lack or want or need. There's nothing missing. And in that sense, it's experienced in that moment by me and understood and as being extraordinarily whole. Again, if something is so whole, it cannot be missing anything. If it's not missing anything, then there really cannot be, again, any sense of lack or want or need or any sense of fear of any kind. And as all of you here have known and experienced on some level yourself, if there cannot be fear, then the sort of natural default setting is something loving. We've often all heard that the opposite of fear is love. And so again, how could there be a sense of loss if it is then the default setting is becoming something that is overwhelmingly loving and missing absolutely nothing of any kind, that it would be impossible to be missing anything of any kind. That also means that it's impossible for there something to be broken or needing to be fixed or wrong or out of place even. And so the notion of the body dying presents itself as kind of an absurd irrelevance. There's no sense of loss in it in any way. There's nothing wrong with it. And again, in that sense, no need for something to be fixed. And so what it really turns into is an experience of all-encompassing and overwhelming peace, out of which the natural default setting is something that is overwhelmingly loving. And that's it. And at some point, my father comes back in the room and has a look and it's like, is he all right? Is he doing all right? And I am doing all right. There is no sense whatsoever of an impulse to share with him that I'm well aware I'm dying. It's a trifle that doesn't even cross my mind in that first instance of his appearance. I feel enveloped in the overwhelming, to quote a popular source, it is the peace that passes all understanding. And um, and as he comes in the room, I smile upon him and feel loving towards him. It's not like, I mean, we're a regular father and son. We didn't have a perfect relationship. He's a good guy, and we had, you know, reconciled my teenage mania as an adult, and we had a good relationship. Um, uh, in that moment, it was just an overwhelming sense of peace, delight, lovingness. I smile. I say absolutely nothing. I can't really imagine how to put any of this into words at all at the time. I feel completely incapable of that. And even if I could have, the idea of looking my father in the eye and saying, hey, you know that thing about my body? Totally irrelevant. Don't even worry about it. And also, I'm dying, and that's good. We're fine. Everything's cool. I can't make any real sense out of it. That seems impossible to say any of those things to him. I say nothing. I'm delighted by saying nothing. It feels right and good to say nothing. And that is how I spend the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. I also, throughout this period of this week, it really has been mind-bending, blackout level pain, which is why I've hardly slept. And but given the present circumstances, this thought arises in my mind, like, well, I might even be able to have a night's sleep, and I do. So I kind of I just lay my head down eventually, and I wake up throughout the night and I check in constantly. Am I still dying? Yes. Is the life force falling away? Yes. It's like watching the mercury recede in a thermometer, and it's going a little bit faster now as well. And have does it feel any different? Do I feel any different? No. Is this a problem? Not remotely. It's fascinating to me. I'm in awe of the process that I'm experiencing. I'm I wake the following morning and again checking in and like still dying. Absolutely yes. A little faster. The time is growing a little shorter. Maybe I have a day and a half. It's a little hard to say, but there's a little bit of time. I spend most of the rest of that next day in precisely the same state of mind that I'm describing. And again, my father comes in and out, and uh, during that following day, there is a moment where something arises in my mind that says something like, what becomes extremely clear is that I actually have a choice. And first of all, essentially the threshold of the doorway, we could call it, to uh, the other side, as it's often called, is wide open. Uh, but it's but it's clear to me I do actually have a choice. I can step through it or not. I would stress that there was no sense in any way whatsoever of that being an effort. There's nothing about stepping over that threshold that was anything other than a simple choice, uh, as quickly and easily as a thought. There's no way whatsoever in which it's difficult, that there's a sacrifice, there's anything to deal with in terms of merit or worthiness or anything. It is merely a choice, and could not be easier than falling off a log. And it's an open choice. And the question arises as well, like, well, why wouldn't you go towards the overwhelming, all-encompassing peace in which there is nothing missing, all is whole, and there's no sense of lack, want, or need? How could that not seem like a good idea? It's an interesting question. And I got to play with it a little bit. And somewhat to my surprise, in fact, there also arose in my mind, in my experience at the time, a thought that simply said, you have an open choice, Jonathan. You can cross that threshold. You're welcome to do that if you wish. Merely a choice. And what arose was something like, I see, I could. It would be an easy choice. And yet I do feel as though there's something here, it, that I should be doing. And it's not quite time. It's just not quite time. There's some things I need to do. Immediately, that's followed by the thought, I don't even know what those things are. What are those things? I, I'm a 29-year-old kid still figuring out how to do life. Maybe I still am today, but except not the 29-year-old part. But but in that moment, it was simply like there was sort of a clear sense of there's some things I think I need to do. I don't know what they are. Maybe I'll figure that out. But I think I'm not going to go through that doorway. It's almost a little shocking to say I'm not going to go through that doorway, knowing what it entails. But I think that's my choice. 49% happy to go, 51% I'll stay. It's real close. It is tight. But I'm like, yeah, I think I'll stay. I think that's also why I have a picture of the earth behind me today. I thought, no, nah, I'm going to stay here. And a couple hours later, my father has come in the room again. And this time he looks at me and he squinches up his face and looks at me real close and says, hey, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we're going to load up the car and head back over to the hospital. And this is a 2-hour drive. It's not a small thing. And I say, all right, let's do it. Let's go. I'm not in a hurry at all. This whole thing seems absurd to me. We load up, we go. I dawdle, I take forever. I'm very quietly trying to whisper out some jokes in the car on the way because I really find the whole thing absurd. I'm trying to make my dad laugh. I don't know why. I get to we go to the emergency room at the same hospital that conducted the surgery. I walk in and whisper to the staff that I'd like to order a pizza. And while we wait in the ER, never mind the fact I couldn't possibly eat one. That would be literally impossible at the time, anyways. It just seemed like a fun thing to say. But that was my mood. And when it's my turn, which it is pretty quickly, the ER docs quickly confirm that my body is in fact dying. It's dying for the dumbest reason in medical science. My body is dying from dehydration, which also means that the fix is exquisitely simple. So they poke an IV bag into my arm with a bunch of saline solution and drain a liter or two right into me. And the instant that saline solution is attached, I feel all of these processes begin to reverse. That life force begins to flow back in. The merging with the infinite begins to reverse, and it's very clear that I am coming back, and that I will be putting my feet back firmly on the ground here. And because of those choices earlier in the day, that seemed like a happy uh, a happy state of affairs. Like that's all right, good. I'm gonna I'm gonna politely turn in the opposite direction of the greatest all-encompassing peace that I could imagine, and I'm gonna come back to this madhouse happily, and with some intention. And I'm often asked if I've often been asked, well, when you realized that you were not your body, were you having an out of body experience? A good question. I bring it up only because I kind of enjoy the subtlety of how the experience really was, which is that I cannot claim, in the way that most people talk about out of body experiences, that it quite fits that category. Here's why. When people talk about the out of body experience, they often, it's as though the body is over here, they are over somewhere else. They're, observing that body, and they're sort of according a relative reality to both of those experiences. I was over here, body was over there. And that makes sense to me. I have had that kind of experience in the end. It hadn't happened yet. Actually, it was coming up later in my experience. Um, but in this particular case, it was actually a little different. It was that when I recognized that I wasn't my body, um, that recognition, I couldn't locate where that recognition was taking place in space. I couldn't point to a place in the room where, oh, I'm here, but the body is over there. And additionally, the notion of that body actually took on what I would call an illusory quality. It was sort of revealed to have essentially been an illusory quality to that body, or an illusory experience of being in the body in the first place. That was itself sort of an illusory experience. And and I put it in those terms because if something is illusory, then it actually lacks any real reality. It is a figment. It isn't real. It doesn't have real being. And if something doesn't have real being to begin with, then there's nothing there actually to be outside of. It is itself a figment. It's like saying, well, I stepped outside of nothing. It just it isn't the nature of the experience in its most specific, you know, truth. It was simply recognized that that body as an illusory experience had actually never been the real container of that being, and that the sense and experience that it had sometimes been the container of that being was fundamentally an illusion. Anyway, I mentioned that because I think it's something we may return to a little later in our time together today as well. Um, and that's because as um, as this whole experience kind of came to its denouement, it came to its conclusion. Uh, in fact, a couple hours after being in the ER, we were driving back to the country, home in the country, and I was sort of reflecting on all these things, uh, and I was indeed happy to be coming back to this world. My recovery, for the record, skyrocketed uh, from that point forward. And so within 3 weeks, I was actually returned to my own home. I returned to my job at the time, which was a very regular thing. Details unimportant, but big company. And and there was a way in which regular life sort of kicked back into gear. And one of the things that people have often asked also is, well, that did it change your life? Were you a changed man from the NDE? And the short answer immediately was no. And the reason for that was that I could not actually reconcile what I knew that I knew and what I had seen that I had seen and experienced what I had experienced. I couldn't figure out how to reconcile that as I was driving to work, rushing because I was late, chomping on a breakfast burrito, trying to make the meeting or whatever it was that I was doing as I made my way through traffic. All it would seem like this body and everything happening here was really quite important. And that was so profoundly different than what I had experienced in the NDE. And in fact, the difference was so large that I couldn't fully reconcile it. And so the fact is that the first thing I did with this NDE experience was bury it completely in my own mind. What it did was turn me into uh, a, quietly and internally and really away from the eyes of everyone in my family and friend circle and my life in general. It turned me into a rather growing ferocity of spiritual seeking. And that was because I couldn't reconcile it. And there was something that began to burn inside me to reconcile it. And so the first thing was to bury it. But all these other experiences began to come my way over the course of the next decade that sort of forced me back in touch with it and forced me to reconcile it. Some of those were other experiences related to death and dying. When a friend is dying, a family member is dying, there comes a point where my father is dying. And in fact, the responsibility falls to me to let the doctors know when to unplug the machines to let him die. And that was a particularly pivotal moment because it was one of those moments that forces me into reconciling with my own experience. And I have always felt stunningly grateful for that. Um, it, Being put in that position with my father, um, I would say grateful because it what it actually did was force me to be back in touch with the freedom and the joy because I knew that's where he was going. And I couldn't acknowledge that unless I acknowledged the experience in myself. And if I acknowledged the experience in myself, I couldn't but help to acknowledge the experience that he was facing himself. And so having to make that choice and tell those doctors when to unplug the machines became an act of service. It became an act of communion. It became an act of beauty. It became an act of joining with him in the last moments of his own journey to um, connect him, connect myself, and connect with those experiences and share with him some of that same freedom, some of that same joy, and some of that same release. And I could not possibly imagine a more beautiful experience to share with another human being than that. And that's also why, when it comes time these days, sometimes to join with others and to join with all of you today, I take that concept of joining in the same way. And so I think at the very beginning of our time together today, there was a mention of connection and how that might be a bit of a theme of the day. And I think it's a deeply, wonderfully, beautifully apt word. And when I think of that word connection, or I think of communion, or one of my favorite words for it is simply joining, as in joining together. It is from these places, it is from this ground to me that those words have meaning. And it's how and why to me today, as we share this joining together, to me it is the same as sharing a touch of this experience. It's impossible to know that experience within here and not to look into the eyes of others and know that that same capacity, that same fundamental being is within each and every one of you. And in our joining today, there is a way in which we get to stand on a moment of that common ground and share that being. And sometimes that's why it's healing. We'll get to that later. Um, but maybe maybe it's time for a question or two.
Thank you, Jonathan. Um, so much for that perspective and sharing your journey with us. That was very beautiful. There's some comments in the chat, but does anybody
Hmm.
have any questions about his experience or his journey so far? He has uh, other experiences as well, so spiritual
Anyone?
experiences. So um, I'll leave that open. Does anybody have any questions? Um, Uh, they're asking if you had been able to reconcile the physical and spiritual more.
Yes, yes, um, yes, certainly. Um, a long process, perhaps if we had more time, um, we can pour over more stories and details and things. But to answer your question and to summarize it as quickly as I can, one of the things that was a core part of that experience at 29 years old in an NDE was, as I tried to put into words, uh, losing that sense of an individuated sense of self, merging into the allness. And there's a way in which that's the core experience that I ended up returning to over the next decade many, many times. It was sort of like, eh, I would say that the it appeared, I guess, necessary in my case to return to some form of that experience, honestly, thousands of times. And that over time, there was something, it had to sink in. It, um, it was, I do think of it sometimes in beautiful, Zen phrase of how the water wears away the rock, but it takes a while. And it's a very incremental process. And that is very much how it felt. But the bottom line is that there came a point, and it was 11 years after that NDE, through a series of other experiences that we don't have time for the details for really at the moment, but that 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 sense of a very, very clear experience of there not actually being an individuated self in there to begin with just simply settled in a way that seemed permanent. And and so it began to be that ground from which I would meet the world. And there's maybe a lot to unpack in that, but that's it is actually going through that experience and that transition that has impacted how I move in the world more than anything else. And that took place again, nearly a decade after that NDE. But that's when life absolutely permanently seemed to change. And reconciling the physical and the spiritual uh, does not present itself as a reconciliation of any way in any way. It just they don't seem any different. There is no difference between them, so there's nothing to reconcile. Essentially, it doesn't mean that clearly there is a physical experience of life as there is here, as there is for all of us. Um, but there doesn't seem to be any contradiction uh, in that at all. So um, let's take another one. And I'm well aware that that means I haven't actually really fully answered the question in the way it was asked, but that'll have to do for the moment. And we'll do another one.
And there's one more, and I'm trying to the way she wrote it. Do you consider these out of body experiences? Um, they had
Hmm.
sinus surgery as well and had all that
Hmm.
things cut away. Um, so but I think you went into that a little bit about.
I did, yeah, and I'll just restate it in a way. I'm well aware of how people use the term out of body experience, and I want to acknowledge and honor the fact that the way people use that term and the way we talk about it is not only helpful to many, and instructive and even conducive sometimes to people having interesting experiences of their own that they find tremendously valuable. That changes nothing. What I'm about to say changes nothing about that. I want to honor that completely, because those are all meaningful steps on the journey, and steps in understanding and steps in our experiential process. And yet, uh, when I talk about this in the way that I experienced it, I do try to be more subtle about it. So rather than saying I had an out of body experience, um, I would say that what I recognized was that the body itself had this illusory quality to it. And if it's illusory, if there's something illusory about something, then it lacks fundamental reality. And if it lacks fundamental reality, then it isn't really there. It may appear as a figment, but it doesn't have real substance. And in that sense, it was recognized very clearly that there was no sense of, there was no being outside of something. It was that that something was recognized to have always been illusory to begin with. So there was no sense of needing to be out of it or in it or it at all. So it's a bit subtle. Um, but here's why it was meaningful for me. It's been meaningful to me in that experience, and it's been meaningful to me ever since. And it's been meaningful to me when I've worked with other people, for instance, because sometimes people would come to me and seek something, seek an experience of their own. And sometimes they would seek a healing experience or something like that. And it became easier to describe what I was not doing with that person than what I was doing. And that's because I this is what we're going to do later, for instance. This is here's a preview for what we'll do a little later. Um, when someone would come to me, I would simply quiet down internally. And what I mean by that is very, very still inside. Would be true for absolutely anyone. This is not unique to me. If one is quiets down internally enough, then even the movements of mind that confer a sense of self can simply quiet. They can simply cease. And if that's so, when that sense of self is simply not there, then then automatically, again, a sort of a natural default, then if there's no sense of an individuated self there, then there's nothing to be separate. And in that sense, then it becomes an awareness or an experience of what is overwhelmingly whole. And if it's overwhelmingly whole and nothing is missing, then there's no sense of there being something broken anywhere. And so when someone would come to me, I would quiet down in that fashion and connect with them. Sometimes I would even put my hand on their head if they were with me in person, which took me a long time to get used to, by the way. I thought it was super, super weird. And it took a really long time to just get comfortable with that. But in the end, even that wasn't critical. It wasn't necessary. It was just an outward symbol of connecting. It was an outward symbol of joining with someone. And it was as though that that wholeness within me connected with wholeness within them and saw that it was identical, saw that it was absolutely the same, not two different sides of the same coin, but just simply the same, simply all one thing. And so if in that wholeness there's no sense of lack, want, or need, there's no way in which there is a sense of, again, there being something broken. And as a result, there's no sense of me being a healer to fix a thing that is broken. It was like seeing past their own illusions of being broken or their own illusions of being not whole or being separate. And simply sharing that in a way, and that some form of, in some way, there would be some experience that would arise in them that would be meaningful to them or acceptable to them or understandable to them in a way that reflected that underlying wholeness. And that's why sometimes they would describe it as a healing experience, because sometimes that's the form that it took. Sometimes that would be a physical shift in them. Sometimes it would be a psychospiritual shift in them. Sometimes it would simply be a sharing of that tremendous peace. And they would say something like, I just feel peaceful in a way I find hard to put into words. And I don't even know what this is. But, and, I feel, I feel blessed to feel this way. um, again, it's coming. This is arising in a way in which there's no sense of an individuated sense of self here to be a volitional force machinating something. None. And so it always became more natural to describe what it wasn't than what it was. Or if someone would say, "Oh, are you a healer?" I'd say, "Oh, I don't know if I'd put it that way. Uh, uh, you doing a thing? Are you doing a thing? Are you moving energy around? What are you doing?" Uh, I'm doing nothing. In fact, I'm not even there at all to be a volitional force making a choice to fix a thing. It's like I, it becomes difficult to put it in anything other than very poetic terms, but it's like saying, I went and sat in that, disappeared into the hand of God. And invited you to join me. And how would this person experience that? They're going to experience it in some way that is unique to them. It's going to come through their matrix of experience and patterning. And whatever's going to arise in them is going to be something that they, again, can accept or understand, and that can take a countless number of forms. Um, some of them quite interesting, quite startling to them. Um, and kind of that's it, full stop. And that's a very long answer. Um, but I think on this one, we really got to the heart of your question more than you may have realized,
Mhm.
or may have been so more than you expected. Um, and we should probably try another one if there's time. And it may be time
We
to
have one more
change
question and then
directions.
yeah, we have one more question and then we need to move on. Um, for Ned. Somebody said, do you experience, they missed part of the first part because they couldn't really hear. They said,
Mm.
did you experience another being while you were in the state you were in? If so, do you think that being, who do you think that being was, or what would it be called?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm often asked that sort of thing, especially when people say, "Was there a tunnel of light? Did you see your loved one? Come on, give us something. Give me something. Were there aliens, family members, something? Come on." In my case, there was no individuated being. And yet, there was the overwhelmingly all encompassing allness that was experienced as missing absolutely nothing. This is one of the ways in which it could seem as though there could not possibly be a sense of loss in any way. Because in that allness, was it possible to attempt to differentiate, machinate with my own mind, meeting the love of those that were close to me? Yes. But that lovingness was could not be seen as differentiated in any way from the overwhelming love of love in general. Um, so was the experience embodied in an individual being? It was not. It was the absolutely all-encompassing whole in which nothing was missing. And to from that standpoint, to understand how one could machinate the idea of an individuated being to embody that love was easily seen. It was sort of like, oh, I can understand the mechanics of how that could easily be. I could do it that way, or understand it in that way. And to me, it's one of the things that felt beautiful in the sense that it gave me in that moment a much greater understanding than I was expecting of how to understand how others' experiences are how there's so much common ground. Like one of the things that you hear very typically throughout spiritual experiences and e experiences and so on and so forth is that they all frequently point to some kind of underlying experience of something very encompassing, lacking in separation, and deeply loving. It's just that the form that takes, the outward form, the perceptual form that takes, becomes remarkably and beautifully individualized for whomever is experiencing that underlying content. And in this moment that I was describing, and I've had many since as well, um, I could see how that projection or how that machination of mind or how that experience could arise. So was there an individuated being that I met? No. It was like meeting all the individuated beings all at the same time in one allness, in which that differentiation was simply, it simply wasn't necessary. Um, and so it didn't come about that way. And yet again, without that individuated presence, there was no sense of lack. So I don't miss it at all. There wasn't a tunnel of light with some family members at the end of it, but it was easy to see how that could be experienced. And I missed out on nothing.
That's
Shall we?
amazing.
Shall we? Yes. Well, let's move on, shall we? And
Oh, thank you for
we'll
that. There's lots of comments, so you can go check the chat, but thank you for that
I'll enjoy
beautiful
that.
perceptions. There,
It,
there
it is
was,
my pleasure.
I still thank you for holding space. It was amazing. Thank you. Mwah. Thank you so much. Now I would like to introduce Ned. And many of you, I am sure, know Ned, but um, Ned has been a seeker since he was a young boy. Having a traumatic childhood led him to seriously question life as a teenager. Discovering near-death experiences along with mediumship transformed his life. In 2012, he attended his first IANS conference in Scottsdale, Arizona, and fell in love with the community and message. In 2013, he started the first and largest near-death experiences group on Facebook, which now has over 190,000 members. Getting the word out about NDEs and life after death is his greatest passion, particularly what is learned about making the most of our temporary lives on earth. Kindness matters. And I just want to say, knowing that and having his group led me to all the other spaces I'm in. So I am so, so thankful for the work you do, Ned. And thank you for speaking for us today.
Thank you, Lorelai. And let's see. Today's theme is a connection. And part of the reason I ended up interested in this whole topic of near-death experiences and life after death is because since I was born until even through my school years in high school, I felt very little true connection with anyone, including a family. Of course, everyone has parents, and some of us have siblings who love us. But have you ever felt like the people in your biological family are not actually closer to you? Um, I definitely felt that, and 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 so even at home, I didn't get the connection or nurturing that I felt um, eh, eh, I needed inside. And at school, it was worse because um, uh, I had an abusive father, emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically, who was a perfectionist. He wanted everything his way. And I was like the opposite of him. I was extremely sensitive and, you know, and so even small insults or slights, I felt them strongly. And so when you have that at home and then you're put in a school where you are shy oftentimes, and um, sometimes struggle speaking, and and you never fit in. It felt like, at home, I was I wasn't seen or heard, and in school it ended up like in middle school and high school, I felt it was like a prison, a place that I was forced into every day. And even though I occasionally learned some facts and whatnot, like I felt like I never fit in with anyone's group. Um, and so because of all this, eventually towards mid high school, I started thinking about suicide. I started wondering, is there a purpose of this? If you don't have a reason to live, why be here? And I have always had a scientific mindset. I've always loved understanding how things work, from machines, cars, computers, cell phones, etc. And because I have this mindset that wants to understand how everything works, I also applied that to life. And so I didn't have a religious upbringing. Like, I did actually sometimes attend a church. Uh, uh, my mom is a Roman Catholic, and all that. However, our family wasn't strongly into that. And uh, my father is also a scientific, he's an electrical engineer, and I went into a computer science, and and so because of that, I didn't have any faith either. I was logical and rational. And in high school, we had our biology class. We learned about evolution and whatnot, and how species evolved. And I thought, this is the answer. This explains it all. It's all a set, and we're basically, a random percent chance. We ended up um, almost like an accident on Earth. Um, uh, Life, how everything began evolving. And so because I thought like that, I thought that there is no intuition or soul or afterlife. And so with that thinking, suicide actually made uh, a sense, sort of like, if you don't have a reason, there isn't anything afterlife, there isn't any purpose. And even if I did that and my family were sad some years or tens of years, eventually they would also die, and all it would all be nothing anyway. And so I had that thought. Um, and it wasn't until I came across other people who had NDEs, and I started examining them, like, the evidence actually checks out. Their medical records are there. Their doctors explain everything that happened, and our current theories don't explain it. It's kind of a mystery. Um, and it really opened my eyes, because even though I'm a scientist and a skeptic, I'm an open-minded one, because many out there are not. um, and and so I started, like, I recall also, just um, out of curiosity, I heard about a a psychic, from a friend, and I thought, almost like a scientist, I want to call them and talk to them and see, if the information has any relevance. It was a complete stranger, um, and so I did that, and over time I started getting readings in terms of mediumship or psychic, and I started becoming friends with NDEers. And one thing you learn is that intuition is real, and people often do know things either about each other or um, uh, future things at times. So it started my search. And also, I remember in college, I took a class in world religions because I wanted to understand, is there any common ground if you look at all of the religions, Eastern, Western, even indigenous. And one thing you learn in every religion is like a core about the golden rule in terms of like they all talk about it in their own way, even though each of them has particular cultural norms or cultural rules. But underneath all that, that message exists about if you hurt someone else, it's like hurting yourself, or if you help someone else, it's helping uh, yourself. And so at that time, I thought that was interesting, but it wasn't until I learned about uh, uh, near-death experiencers who talk about that, and they actually live that during their life reviews and experience all the emotions and feelings that the other people experienced, and a lot of them um, come back at, um, wanting a change of heart, a change of how they treat others, but also um, how they uh, treat their time and life. And so um, that was eye-opening and is still one of my greatest inspirations is that life review. Um, and um, like Lorelei mentioned, in 2012, I attended my first IANS conference, and it was in Scottsdale, Arizona. And it was interesting. IANS, if you've ever heard of it, or if you haven't heard of it, it's the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and it's the first and main group, even still, who are taking NDEs seriously and actually studying them. If you've heard of Raymond Moody, the doctor who um, wrote Life After Life in 1975, he basically started this whole movement or acceptance of it. And so it was him, and Dr. Bruce Grayson, and several other doctors who formed IANS in the mid 70s. And at these conferences, you often have experiencers who share their stories. You also have researchers, nurses, doctors. It's interesting how how oftentimes nurses tend to be more interested. Doctors are slowly becoming interested, and I think it's interesting how since many nurses tend to be women, women are more open to spiritual things, just as a generalization. Many of the stereotypical male doctors of the past, were very set in their thinking about, it has to be a brain hallucination or something, and kind of ignored it. But that's changing over time. So even Dr. Uh, uh, Pim van Lommel, who is in the Netherlands and who is I think, a cardiologist. He is one of the first uh, doctors in Europe who basically started taking these seriously. Um, and and um, IAND's conferences, if you're ever curious or interested, I recommend them because of that whole theme of a connection. One thing that is common among experiencers, as Jonathan he mentioned, is they tend to open up a person's intuition, or they tend to change a person's perspective from the strictly me to we. It's kind of like the whole. And so you'll often find experiencers who, even if you haven't ever met them, when they see you, it's almost like a a recognition, and it's almost like a sense of family, because intuitively you can understand each other. You can kind of realize how similar we all are, and a lot of people have said, like, under the hood, we are all parts of God. We all are one, and a lot of experiencers also learn that, and they return and realize that it isn't about the divisions of um, a country or religion or particular groups. It's it's we're all fingers uh, on the same hand. And Anita Morjani, who's also an experiencer, a famous one, she um oops, I clicked on something. uh, uh, she always talks about how, in her experience, she learned the power of cooperation over a competition, and that in our wars, or even our schools or our economies and businesses, it's often about a competition and winning. It's about earning the most. If you're a company, or if it's a country, it's taking over land and resources, and on the history of Earth, it has been this way for so long. If you think about even how when the Europeans took over the land in America and all that, and it's just a part of how humans have lived. It is with this survival and this competition and taking over mindset. And almost every experiencer, when they come back, they realize how backwards it is. How all of us are basically the same, and we're all ultimately on the same team. And if we do hurt others or take advantage of others, it does reflect on us, on our character, on our soul, and oftentimes people in their life reviews will have to see that and feel that. And then ultimately, if you take into account the idea of other lifetimes, which a lot of experiencers they talk about, is balancing. And so, like, if a person takes advantage of other people, maybe in another lifetime they kind of understand oh, I did that and I caused an imbalance. Let me return and give back and kind of uh, restore balance. And so that is a concept I think about a lot, and we think about it as karma, although it isn't literally, exactly, um, but it's kind of an overall a theme or idea. Um, let's see. I do have a question. If anyone so far has a question, and if not, I'm um, I have some experiencers who I want to talk about. Um,
Does anybody have
so
a question, Super? Yeah, we'll keep moving for now.
okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Um, so um, uh, uh, near-death experiencers um, uh, get an expansion of their thinking, and one of them who I have been personally inspired by is David Bennett, who actually uh, uh, was a commercial diver, and his experience happened in 1982 in the ocean. Um, he was actually in a storm. It was nighttime in off the coast of Ventura, and he ended up drowning in the ocean. Um, and um, and in his experience, he actually met soul family. Kat is asking if I had an NDE, and that's a great question. What's interesting is that I don't have conscious memories of an NDE. However, a lot of experiencers who I talk to have told me that I have had one as an infant. And I've talked to even mediums who are sensitive to energy and have told me that my energy is like someone who's had one. And I've always felt different. I've also had people tell me that I could be a extra terrestrial, in terms of like I'm kind of new here on Earth, and so because of that, like exactly, uh, because what's interesting is that as a kid, even I felt like the people on Earth, like I couldn't understand why there was so much strife here, and people kind of always bickering and arguing and whatnot. Like it felt like where I'm from or what I'm accustomed to is a lot more peaceful, civilized, relating. And one thing that I've kind of had to learn here on Earth is is how we're all learning and growing in our own times and our own ways. And it's reminds me of the whole concept of other lifetimes and how some of us have had many lifetimes and some of us are pretty new or perhaps we are from other places. And I guess I do have a question. If anyone here in the audience has felt like that, like if you have felt or have been told you're actually here to help people kind of awaken or just remember the importance of kindness, because in the world or in politics, in our news, everyone is often so polarized in terms of like forgetting unity and jumping to attacking or jumping to individualism, like, but extreme individualism, which is almost like part of our culture. Um, and and if we look at our topic of a connection, it's bridging all of that. It's even bridging, like if people think about how often love is the answer. Uh, we hear that a lot, but then if you can picture, and this isn't for any side, but if you can picture loving, let's say, Obama and a Trump equally, is that even possible? If you can do that, then then it's a true um, spiritual consciousness. And so something that I think about a lot and I try to remind everyone is that um, uh, we often have uh, disagreements here because we have different perspectives and we have different experiences that shape our values. And so if we look at a situation and we see a problem and we think the answer is X, and someone else looks at the problem and sees um, in their eyes the answer is actually Y, and then they argue over it. Um, uh, what often ends up happening is that it becomes personal insults, and it doesn't actually help anything. In fact, it's the opposite. And my message is even um, if we have a disagreement, or if you have one with a friend or a stranger or someone on the internet, remember how we talk about we're all souls here, and we're all fingers on the same hand. And ultimately, if we do hurt others, even including with our words, it will come back to us, eventually. And it's like after we review it, it's almost like, why did I put that energy out? Why did I add to that negativity? Like I could have helped the situation rather than put fuel on the fire. So like I try to get us to apply what we know. And so even though I don't have like a memorable NDE, I do have a passion of um, showing us how we can love. And if you think about it, like Jesus, his whole message, it was exactly this, and it was exactly the message of Andy Ears. It's basically love everyone, even your enemy or the person that you think is your enemy. And if we do that, we can help heal each other, because ultimately, I've also heard how a lot of people are not interested in the idea of incarnation or other lifetimes. Have you heard or have you personally felt like Earth is hell? Why would I ever return here in the future? This is the last time I'm here, and that's it. And then, but if you can imagine, like, what if, you know, uh, you do end up coming here in the future, either by choice, or a combination of being chosen and agreeing. And I say that because a lot of experiencers, they talk about how we come to Earth by our own choice, and our soul has different priorities than our ego. Our ego often wants comfort and happiness, and that's it. Our soul is like, that's awesome, but even if there's also pain or suffering, if it can help to grow us and mature us, that's also valuable. Um, and so, um, oftentimes our lifetimes are difficult, but they have a purpose in the end, especially if we live intentionally. Um, but I asked earlier, if we knew that we could potentially return here, wouldn't we want to make this a little better place? And so it's like, well, if I do have to return, at least I know in the future it'll be better because I contributed and I made it a little better. And I think if we all had that mindset, it would help us out now and in the future, even if we don't end up returning here. But even if we think about our children and our descendants, if we want to make this a better place, a better a better place, either like in terms of um, uh, nature and improving that, like the Amazon and the forests and healthier air and water and all that, but also in a healthier um, energetic place in terms of how people are treating each other. Um, hold on. It's almost like the saying of if you have problems or faults, and we all do, um, and even if you move or end up somewhere else, um, you still have them in terms of like whatever our issues are, we can't really escape them if we just, let's say, end up somewhere else, or if we end up around other people, because our same issues, our same uh, uh, wounds come up again. And so if we can work on ourselves now and heal ourselves now, it improves our experience in the future, um, regardless. And something that experiencers, they talk about a lot is that part of the gift of life here on Earth, and in it being difficult, is that it it forces us to grow in a way that, if we're in peace and we're enveloped in love, we never have to. And so it's the whole thing about learning and growing in adversity. Um, I'm looking at the chat here. Thanks, Abby. And my curiosity now is if anyone wants to speak up, if they relate, or if they have any questions. Like, I don't know if anyone else has felt almost like an alien here as I have, or if anyone else has a comment about, like, other lifetimes, or doing a self work to improve ourselves now, because one thing I'll say is that a lot of experiencers have said, as amazing as it is in spirit, where everything is all united and beautiful and supported, it's almost like the actual value is here, and the actual uh, opportunity is here. The actual applying and living it is here. And so um, I, I I always remember a Mellon Thomas Benedict, who had an NDE in 1983 of a brain cancer. And he used to be extremely cynical. He thought that humanity was a cancer on the earth because we were basically destroying the forests and oceans and everything. And so he was a pessimist. And I think he was an atheist. He had an NDE, and he met a higher power, aka God or source, and it basically showed him how beautiful our souls are and how we are all connected, and that even if it looks like chaos on earth, we all are growing and there is a purpose behind it. But he was actually uh, offered a choice to either stay there or return, and he was also shown that if he returned, it would give him an opportunity to basically clean up his act and change how he lived, because he used to be extremely cynical. I think he would often make fun of religious or spiritual people, and he kind of had an ego, as all of us at times have. And so he basically returned, and at that time he had been in hospice because his brain cancer, it was a terminal, and when he had his NDE in hospice, I think he was out uh, 90 minutes, and he woke up completely shocking everyone, because it was basically thought to be his end. He woke up, and he said how for about 5 minutes he just repeated, whispering, like, "I love my life, I love my life, I love my life," because he realized he was given a chance to make things better, and also in terms of how he treated other people, how he talked to other people, how he viewed himself, um, completely changing his cynical attitude. Um, so, Lorelai, how are we on time? Or does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, we're doing pretty good on time. I just want to check if anybody has any questions for Ned.
I'm looking at the chat.
Yeah. Oh, okay. There's a question right here if you see it. You're a very special soul and have a deep love of people. I was specifically given the knowledge of God, heaven, and hell. The word God was conveyed, not verbally, but a knowledge. Do you believe in a specific God?
Oh yeah. Well, at this point, just like many experiencers, like I'll say, I don't believe in God as much as I now know, and so it's kind of like um uh, from everything I have learned, um uh, God is beyond words or labels, and it's um there is a higher power who basically knows us infinitely, like everything about us, even more than we know ourselves. It has a sense of humor, and even one experience where they said, "Where do you think ours comes from. It's almost like people talk about how we are children of God, and a lot of experiencers will say that it's like we're basically learning to be more like that, a more loving, funny, powerful, wise, but also not boring and stuck up. It's like everything. uh, um, uh, and so I do often pray a lot, and I do know there is a God, and there are angels, and there are guides, and there are our loved ones, and how Jonathan, he said that like we're all connected in spirit, and we can all uh, feel how other people are feeling. A lot of experiencers will say that in spirit, our thoughts are telepathic, and even we are basically naked in terms of like you can't hide anything. And so exactly who you are and what you think and feel is known. And so which is also a reason uh, why it's valuable on Earth, because here we get to experience kind of the opposite of that, of like, okay, if I have a enclosed protection or a closed surface, um, how will I act within that? And then it's almost like afterlife, we basically take off our blindfolds or borders, and we look at everything and how we all treat each other. Keisha, I see your hand up.
Yep. This question is a bit more personal, a bit about your own process. So you mentioned how, part of being here is for soul growth, and so that's where we, come into a multitude of different type of experiences. In those challenging moments, like I know, it's one thing to say, therefore, our growth and expansion, but in them, it's a bit different. What in your challenging moments, what practices or tools do you utilize that help bring you to a place of like gratitude or acceptance when it kind of, feels like, well, challenging, Does that make sense?
Yeah. Um, oftentimes like if I'm struggling or if I need help, I definitely pray a lot. And at this point, being friends with so many NDEers and mediums, it's almost like uh, any skepticism I had of all this is completely erased. And I forget, for a lot of people, it's the opposite. For a lot of people, they still, it's like a concept of like of an assuredness of God, or assuredness of our loved ones existing in spirit, is still extremely uh, weak, in most people. But because of this knowing, I definitely pray and ask. If I struggle, I will often I'll sometimes exercise, because it changes, like if you have any anger or fear, it kind of helps to release that. I I definitely think about gratitude a lot, and I think about, what is a positive in this situation. And I've learned that from experiencers a lot. Um, I can actually, I'll recommend a book, and I'll put it in chat, and I'll say it too. Uh, I think it's called The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, and it's by Dr. Sunfellow. I'll type it right now. Um, and and I purchased it on Audible. So um, when I drive, I often play it, and it's just like story after story, and they're all true, about what people learned. And when you hear that for so long, it helps you reframe your thinking in terms of like, okay, I'm in an uncomfortable situation. What do I remember. Um, um, and one thing that a lot of experiencers they talk about is every situation is a gift, even the painful ones or the uncomfortable ones. And so if I'm in an uncomfortable situation, I often remember that. And I say, is there a positive in here or like a silver lining? Um, uh, what is it? Perhaps it's just a matter of, it's like, oh, great, I'm being humbled, because at times we all need that. Or perhaps it's a matter of, oh, like this is uncomfortable. And so the good thing about it is I know that my comfort zone is expanding and therefore I'm growing. And so at this point, like I don't have a lot of particular tools, like objects or mantras, but it's just knowing that everything that uh, NDEers they talk about, um, it helps. It's like that wisdom and living in that. But also one thing that I've learned is just always ask for help because there are angels, there are beings who can hear it, and oftentimes they can't jump in to help us. Um, until we ask. And I see
Thank you
Lorelai.
so much. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ned. Is there anything else in closing that you would like to say before we move on?
Just that remember, like in every situation, uh, uh, apathy on earth is common. And so a lot of people out there are not spiritual, or if they are, it isn't like an internalized living spirituality yet. And so just remember how important it is every day, every moment, how we're treating each other and ourselves. And so if we're ever like, like, oh my God, I hate that person, I told them not to do this and they did it. And it's that kind of a negative a cycle. If you say, hey, wait a minute, I'll change that. I'll release that. Is there a way I could frame this more positively?
Beautiful, beautiful. So true, so true. The power of perception in that sense. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge. And I know you have so much, but thank you for sharing the things today that you did of connection and these experiences and the commonalities with all of them. I think that's so important to see how that all connects. So thank you so much for being here today, Ned, and for holding space with us. We're going to move back to Jonathan to talk about how he moved into it. Some would call a healer, but as I say, you're whole and holy as you are. But so, like he was saying, so I'm very interested to hear what Maury has to say about that and guiding us through this healing, this understanding of healing. Thank you, Jonathan. You're muted still.
All right, there we are. Sure thing. And one more shout out to Ned as well. Uh, I I didn't have any idea that the vast worldwide community of NDE related content and the huge amount of interest that there is in it in the world, I had no idea it existed until about a year and a half ago. And one of the things that I could say pretty definitively is that Ned has indeed created a remarkably and particularly deep and rich community in that way. and has done an amazing job in that. And so just one more shout out to Ned, and I'm sure he can share more about how to be in touch with all of that on his behalf. Um, so, all right, we have a little bit of time left, and um, so let's keep this train moving in the direction that we've been headed all morning so far, or afternoon. Ah, um, so I want to invite everyone into this. I mean, here we are already. But by invite into, I just mean to even be, I guess, make a even more specific and a point of inviting all of us to join in this together. And we do that in the degree, whatever, quite correctly and appropriately, we do that in whatever degree is most comfortable and most accessible for everyone here. I mentioned earlier that there were times when I would be with someone and would put a hand on their head and things like that. And one of the things that I would always do in that instance was to ask very explicitly if it was all right to put a hand on somebody's head. It just seems polite, for one thing. Uh, and uh, and for another, it always seemed appropriate. Um, it was always appropriate that I asked that question, not just to be polite, but from my point of view, asking that gave that person an opportunity to, within the confines of their own mind, really weigh for a moment what their readiness or willingness, or what their inclination was, what their comfort level was, and gives them, within the confines of their own mind, an opportunity to sort of weigh their own choices, essentially, in a way that was a little bit more conscious for them than it would have been if I hadn't asked the question. And even though we are spread all around the world, I'm aware that on our screen today, there are people from time zones all over the world here. And I love that. I'm charmed by it. So, some of us are separated from each other on this planet Earth by literally almost 8,000 miles. So no one's putting hands on anyone's head physically. But described, what I'm inclined to do is suggest to you that we band together, we join together. In that metaphoric way, I would like to offer the opportunity to connect in that way that I often do when people are sitting in front of me when we're together in person in a room. And there's no need to do this out loud, but in the confines of your own mind, I invite you to see if it's something that you'd like to do in the way that I described, in terms of actually connecting with each other. Again, if I was in the same room with each of you, I might ask if it was all right to put a hand on your head. And if that's okay, you can say yes. And if it sounds like not quite okay, that's completely fine. uh, and if it was a polite no, that's absolutely fine as well. The act of going through that process of asking the question and having that response is what's important, not the actual outcome of it. So anyway, I invite everyone into that to whatever degree and level they are comfortable. And with that said, I'm going to go into I'm going to approach this in the way that I described earlier. I'm going to invite everyone to join me in quieting down for a few minutes. We'll take a couple of deep breaths. And I love to be a little bit specific about the deep breaths. There's actually some science behind this, some real hard science in the way our autonomic nervous systems actually work. So what I'm going to suggest is we take a deep breath in together. We're going to hold that for just a second, and then put another deep breath on top of that. I'll demonstrate first, and then it'll go like this. It's like deep breath in, hold for a moment, and then let it out with a little bit of air, a little bit of noise. We'll do that a couple of times. And you can look up the science for this if you like, but one of the things that that does, it puts a little bit of pressure and tension in your torso. And the way that it does it, when you release it, actually sends some autonomic nervous signals to your mind and to your body in turn to literally relax. So this is something that's at times been taught to people that have anxiety in various forms, that this is something anyone can do in an actual physical moment of anxiety that will physically give their body a signal to relax a little bit. And so it's a great way to get this started. We're going to do that a couple of times, then we'll just quiet down. And then I just invite everyone to be connected together, and we will sit in some pure silence for a little while and just quiet down. And as I described earlier, the process that takes place within me is it's very automatic. It's very natural. There's no effort to it in any way on my part. That internally, I'll go to that place in which there is simply, it's very quiet and there's no sense of an individual itself at all. And again, in that, if there's nothing there to seem separated, then the sort of automatic default setting is that there's no sense of separation. And so it's sort of this automatic default of seeming tremendously whole. And it's in that way that, to me, there's no way for us to join in this at all without it being a very collective experience. There's no way for it not to be from that standpoint. And that's one of the things that I love about it, in fact. And again, I just simply invite you into that. It's, to me, another way I often think about it is it's like inviting someone to take a walk with me, a quiet walk. And it's why one of the things that one of the phrases I've often used in various times and places is that it's nice to be walking in spirit with someone. This is what that literally means to me. So I invite you into that experience with me, to whatever degree you are inclined. Here we go. A couple of deep breaths. All right. I know. Do that again. Here we go, simply into our own quietude. There may be some noises in the background. They're perfectly fine. They don't matter. There may be thoughts that roll through your head. They're perfectly fine. And let them roll by. Go simply to that quiet center. right, my friends, we have only a few moments left. There's much more we could do, perhaps another time. I can say for myself that it was really a sweet and gentle joy to share some quiet moments with you. And there may be some of you, if you wish, we really have just a scant few moments. We could have spent much longer there, I'm sure, happily, really happily. Um, but we have just a moment or two, and I'd like to give it back to Lorelei, or to, if there's a moment for someone that wants to take that last chance to say the thing that's on their heart or on their mind. We have this moment. This is it.
Thank you,
I'll let
everyone.
Lorelei take it from there. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. I know some had to go. We have about 10 more minutes, but I'm gonna go ahead, Betty, and then we will go on to Ned for his Rev Ned for his closing blessing. Betty, you have your hand up?
You want to unmute
Hopefully y'all can. I really appreciate that chance to be here on my trailer. And I'm certainly from that before, and it was talking about every experience that I wanted to add to that.
Oh, she was having some connection issues. We'll give her a minute and see. She's back. Betty, are you back? Can you speak now? You have some connection issues.
Yeah.
We couldn't
Yes,
understand
I
you.
am.
Okay.
But I just it's like our attitude and how we perceive that really dictates our experience. So I was just wanting to add that. And I just like it was a lovely time that we
I
Betty,
apologize, Betty. We can't hear you. Your connection is just really poor right now.
from what I heard, she was saying about how I mentioned how every experience is a gift, even the uncomfortable and painful ones. I didn't hear after that, however, but yes, like and oftentimes in our darkest moments, we're always learning. So uh, so if we can remember that, it can help. Jonathan, when it was interesting how he said he learned he was dying, or his physical body, and he found it humorous. Like it's almost like even in our worst situations, if we can laugh or we can see it as a positive, it changes everything.
Thank you for sharing that, Ned. That's beautiful. And no worries, Betty. We will move on to Mr.
Lorelei,
Rev Ned. Mm-hmm.
very quickly, and this is for everyone, including Betty there, who we couldn't hear. Ned, please do not let me speak for you or for you, Rev Ned, either. But my suspicion is that any of us would be more than happy to, if any of you wish to be in touch and ask your question or express what you wanted to express another time. I can certainly say this for myself. All of you are welcome to reach out and be in touch. It's a pretty open door policy around here, and as you like. So I'll leave it at that. Please, Lorelei, back to you.
Thank you. And yes, I put all Jonathan's information in the chat. So if you want to connect further with him, it is there for you. And we're going to move on to our closing blessing. Rev Ned grew up with the energies of oneness of the woods and the energies and entities thereof. His older cousin spent much time living in Rev's home, and as a young teen, providing a base to expand his current being. His cousin would teach him about NDEs and multidimensional beings. Rev has taught at Pure Love for over 40 years. RevNet's career was managing international grad student housing and creating programs for diversity gatherings where he has met beautiful ones from 177 countries. He has facilitated earth ceremonies even as a teen, not knowing they were called this. He also has been part of the Lakota ceremonies of various kinds for 30 years. His NDE was in November of 2018 and was a confirmation of being a messenger of pure love and bringing the heart energies and mind energies together in a toroidal energy release. Before his NDE and during his NDE, the hidden ones, the little people, were with Rev. He had a stroke in July of 2021, and during his 13 days of rehab, a high-density being who came to visit him, which expanded his energies of pure love and pure love residue in the room where many could sense. Welcome, Rev, and thank you for holding space with us.
Thank you, Lorelei, and thank Ned, thank Jonathan, and each and every one of you. It's an honor. It's a special word in Native ceremonies. An honor to be here among you. The blessings of the Corn people be with you. The Corn people have taught Rev that the spiritual and material life are closely integrated, intertwined. The corn seeds in this rattle are 2,000 years old. And it's a gift from Flute Song, better known as Robert Mirabal, to Rev. He is Taos Pueblo. Think of the energies, these seeds, the rattle shaking as a form for them to speak of their 2,000 years of being. These seeds watch over Rev every night. They are elders that teach. There is many sharing of key words and energies. Divine love, blessings and love, inner click, life force, overwhelming peace, merging with infinite, connections, joining, open-minded one, we. On the same team, balance, importance of kindness, connecting, bridging. We can love, heal one another in love, live intentionally, self-work. I love my life. Gratitude. What a bringing together of precious souls that we have interconnected with in this gathering, grounding and gleaning and moving and loving and transforming energies. Our energies have met and merged and magnified here on this celebration of consciousness, a mystical grid of amazing vibrations. We can experience the mystical ways of how truly connected we are within our eternal uniqueness that is wrapped in divine oneness. What sacred ground this is, where we can come together to share our heart thoughts and our head thoughts of our life experiences within us and beyond us, of the divine within us, the cosmos within us, merging and being one. Our inner sanctuaries are meeting and meshing right here and being weaved together to create a divine, cherished, consecrated place. You see, beloved ones, this celebration of consciousness has and is declared to be holy, set apart for higher purposes as we celebrate one another's conscious interconnecting in the divine weave. I'm nudged to share this power-pondering quote from an Oglala Sioux spiritual leader who crossed over about 3 years before Rev was born in this last arrival. Here are the words of Grandpa Black Elk. Quote, "What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of the buffalo in the wintertime. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset. The true peace The first piece, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of people when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all its powers, and when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells the Wonka Tonka and Tagashla, and that center is really everywhere. It is within each of us. This is the real peace, and the others are part of this life. End of quote. Beautiful, eternal beings. Rev sees our oneness when I look at the glorious sunset on our hill, sitting on the back deck of oneness. The sun speaks strong words. Sitting in a sweat lodge, one has entered the womb of Mama Earth and the cosmos, that we are connected and in oneness with all that is. Yes, the lodge speaks. Working with the elements expands Rev's awareness of being the elements, and they remind Rev how connected each one of us are in so many ways. The elements speak. The wind people bring messages almost each day. And for over the 3 decades, Rev has met folks from 177 countries, managing the international graduate housing. What an experience to see the divine in all these souls from so many different religious paths and walks, including the atheists and the communists. The truth within them speaks, like much truth that has been shared among us this sacred day. Rev has been touched by Lorelei and Ned and Jonathan, and each one of you eternal creations of all that is. Lorelei and Ned and Jonathan have spoken, as some of you have in your written words, in your physical words. They're powerful when they're wrapped in wisdom and pure love. I have sensed much of the energies of this sacred space, this sacred ground we have gathered on, are the vibrations of us being grounded this day or having the opportunities to do so. The analogy of a home being grounded is the same for you and I being grounded. Grounding for us protects us by energy charges building up within us, within our wiring. So being grounded directs stray voltage into the ground, the earth, and discharges it safely. You talk about Mama Earth taking care of us. If we are not grounded, our electrical circuits become dangerous by building up, causing power surges, equipment damage, and shocks to our systems. Sounds just like Rev's stroke in 2021. You know what else? What else has been shown to Rev? The grounding that has been released this day here on this sacred ground of this gathering is the energies being shared, and the energies within us become or can become stabilized to spread the correct amount of our flowing energies to our systems within us to prevent overloads and blown circuits. As Grandpa Black Elk said, what is life? It's the flash of a firefly at night. It's the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. And life is also us connecting, bridging, and being in such set apart ways, and gathering and sharing and listening and being in oneness brings us gifts within us and beyond us. Rev asks Wonka Tonka, Tagashla, and the entities and energies of the 4 directions and Mama Earth and her children to bring beautiful energies into our heart thoughts, into our head thoughts, into our inner essence, and be wrapped in pure love with a weaving of tranquility and eternal oneness. Precious ones, allow the energies of the corn people to remind each one of us that we can have solid roots to be grounded when the storms come our ways. We're nourished, connected by Mama Earth as we reach the sky rivers. The corn people are the 4 elements, just like us. Yes, we are relations. You are a gift that provides needed energies to the human consciousness. You are a blessing to the cosmos. The greatness and wonder of the authentic you is beyond definition. Let us be covered in thanksgiving and appreciation for this gathering, for one another, as we've come here to connect and to bridge. So it is, eternal ones. No.
Thank you so much for that beautiful closing blessing, Ned. And for all of you who held space today, and for our speakers, Jonathan, Ned, and Rev Ned, I'm so thankful that you held space with us today.